carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the
1619 was a major year in Virginia's history. It was a year of firsts. The first ironworks, the first college, the first Thanksgiving, the supposed arrival of the first women, and potentially the first Africans entered the colony as well. And arguably the most notable first in 1619 was the establishment of the colonies and America's first representative governmental body.
Long were the days in the spring when we were younger. Oh, the years have gone like the breeze in the summer. Seasons come and they go, like the dust on that old dirt road. I try and fight to take it slow, but the ground keeps.
The first women actually arrived before 1619, but the few who did come were for the most part already married to male settlers in Virginia. Otherwise, those who were not married were personal servants, such as 14-year-old Anne Burris, maid to Mistress Forrest, and the first English bride in Virginia, who married John Leyden in 1608, 3 months after her arrival. Other wives and women, such as Temperance Flowerdew and Jane Pierce, emigrated to Virginia before 1619, but they were few and far between. So with the male population far outweighing the female, by 1617, most men saw Virginia as more of a short-term investment opportunity. They'd venture across the Atlantic, stay for a few months or years, and then return to England after making a fortune, if they were lucky enough to still be alive. Those who remained began clamoring for that feminine touch, and the Virginia Company started to take notice. To that end, those company leaders had to devise a plan to attract 17th century female English attention by using Virginia's limited charms as bait. First, they promised to relax the prevailing English marital laws known as coverture, in which the wife was legally under the husband's protection and authority. Such laws in England meant that a widow could not inherit her deceased husband's estate, or at best only a very small portion of that estate. For a time, coverture was relaxed in Virginia, and in some cases waived entirely. One Virginia woman, Hannah Bennett Turner Tompkins Arnold, you can tell by her name alone that she married more than once, played this new legal system to her advantage. She was an only child who inherited 450 acres of land after her parents died. Her first husband willed his estate to Hannah before he died. She then added more land and wealth after her second husband signed a sort of prenuptial agreement, and then died leaving his estate to Hannah. Next, she created a deed of gift that left her now considerable holdings to her children in case she died before her third husband. But no matter, he died first, and she also added his lands to her already substantial holdings. Had Hannah lived in England, she would have had none of these opportunities available after the first, let alone the third, husband passed away. Further, women could also own some land outright in that the male Virginian settlers asked the company to grant land in their potential brides' names, a request that the company answered positively because, as the company records from the First General Assembly stated, quote, "In a new plantation, it is not known whether man or woman be the most necessary." This is why some women, like Mary too, were able to buy and sell stock or land, such as she did when she sold 100 acres of Diggs's 100 and stock to Samuel Jordan in 1622. The company also sweetened the deal by offering clothing and other various feminine accessories to women willing to make the trip. Thus, with the potential rewards being offered, it would seem that the type of woman who made her way to Virginia would be from society's lower classes. But this wasn't the case. To ensure morally upright and chaste women signed on to the Virginia venture, the company enacted a somewhat rigorous vetting system, A willing woman had to receive testimonials and recommendations from those willing to go with her to the Virginia Company offices. Such a process ensured that no scandal was afoot, and that only the best women from England's early growing middle class would be considered worthy. These women had to be from at least the middle class, because the cost to make it across the Atlantic had to be covered by the woman and or her family. It wasn't a light sum either, 120 pounds of tobacco, or about 18 pounds sterling, somewhere around $4,500 in 2016's currency. The price was to cover the 12-pound cost to sail to Virginia, which would make it seem like the company was making a profit by selling women to sex-starved men. But that was most likely not the case. The remaining 6 pounds profit was not actually profit at all when one factors in the 8-pound additional cost that the company paid to clothe each potential bride. The company therefore was actually losing 2 pounds per each emigrating woman. The call for women went out in the summer of 1619 and was met later that fall to the early spring of 1620 by 90 young, handsome, and honestly educated maids. An extra 49 more came in 1621. They were very welcomed arrivals, as all of them were married before Christmas 1621. Soon, more women came over the course of the ensuing years, which greatly helped to balance the almost 7-to-1 man-to-woman ratio from the early 1620s down to 3-to-1 by the end of the century. The tobacco brides, as they've often been called, were a success. They came to Virginia to abide by choice, and because of their choice, the Virginia colony remained in spite of the horrendously high mortality rate that hammered the young settlement. Before moving on, I need to address a final thought that doesn't really fit into the narrative. One might ask, what about the native women? Why didn't the women-starved men marry from the Powhatan tribes? With the exception of John Rolfe and Pocahontas and a few other potential outliers, cohabitation with native women was forbidden, and even punishable by death in some instances. Further, it was socially frowned upon. Thus, the English did not intermarry with the Powhatan natives, nor were the English permitted to marry from the other peoples introduced in 1619, 20 Angolans.
So paint the colors of fall on my heart, so I'll remember to carry through the pain and the cold of the winter.
The Spanish had been transporting captured Africans into their New World holdings for decades, and when Spain acquired Portugal, it also gained her colonial empire, which included regions of southern Africa. Thus, Manuel Méndez de Cunha, captain of the San Juan Bautista, secured a license to collect and carry slaves from Angola, Africa, and transport them to Mexico for work in Spanish mines. The Spanish slave trade was a centralized money machine. King Philip III needed funds to operate the mines, so he sold slave trading rights to men like Antonio Fernandes Delvas, a Portuguese businessman, for 115,000 pesos. Pretty hefty sum. In return, Delvas ensured that he'd make money on his investment by funneling potential slaves into one of two New World ports, Veracruz, Mexico, or Cartagena, Colombia. This is where men like Acuna enter the picture. Delvas needed to enlist experienced sea captains to make his often fatal journey and meet his annual target of importing 3,500 to 5,000 slaves. Many of them would come from Angola. Luanda, Angola was a key cog in this immoral machine. The king of Ndongo fought bitterly against Portuguese invaders, and after early Portuguese victories, Ndongo won a massive victory himself in 1589, which altered how slaves were acquired. Now, instead of defeating tribes and sending the captives out to the New World, the Portuguese had to purchase Africans captured by the Ndongo. This was how the slave trade operated along the East African coast for centuries, before Portuguese arrival in southwestern Africa. But the Spanish could not live with the post-1589 setup, and in 1617 King Philip III appointed Luis Méndez de Vasconcelos to be governor of Angola. Vasconcelos vowed to conquer the Ndongo while also marching eastward to Mozambique. But the new governor overestimated his resources. He soon realized how limited his army was upon arrival, and then set about enlisting help from black armies recruited by local chiefs loyal to Portugal. The Sobas, as they were called, often proved unreliable, however. So Vasconcelos found murderous help elsewhere. He found the Imbangala.
Calloused my skin, broke my bones, it left me bleeding. Through the darkest storm, he was there. Now I'm still breathing.
The Imbangala were a somewhat legendary group of land pirates, if one can call them that in any true sense. They raided other African tribes, conquered them, and then sucked them dry before leaving for their next conquest. Portuguese traders often purchased boatloads of slaves from the Imbangala, but at first Vasconcelos wanted nothing to do with the, quote, enemies of all living things and thieves of all the lands, as he called the Imbangala. Yet he changed his tune when all other options ran out. He turned to the vile Imbangala and undertook a massive killing spree. Those not killed by the new alliance were then taken against both their own will as well as the regulations laid down by King Philip III. In less than 6 months, the Ndongo were destroyed. Their cities were obliterated. Thousands were sold into slavery. The heinous alliance that produced this outcome fractured soon after the Ndongo were conquered, and the Imbangala continued their killing spree eastward into Africa without Spanish aid. But Vasconcelos had what he wanted, a lot of Ndongo peoples to sell into slavery at Luanda. Many slave traders crammed into the port looking to purchase as many Ndongo tribesmen and women as they could. One of those traders was Manuel Méndez de Acuna, who steered his San João Bautista into the fray. Once in position, Acuna set about choosing 350 men, women, and children. The shackled Ndongos were herded into their month-and-a-half-long floating prison, after which they were christened by the Catholic hierarchy according to Portuguese law. The ship left Luanda sometime in late June or early July 1619, and it reached the Bay of Campeche by mid-August. But before it could unload her cargo, 2 ships, what Acuna called corsairs, came into view. History's record has them as the White Lion and the Treasurer. Both ships were English, and were supposedly to have been at peace with Spain and her dominions during this time. Therefore, their captains had to use a few loopholes to get around the anti-piracy laws in place. If the name Treasurer sounds familiar to you, it's because we've discussed this ship before. 4 times, in fact. It was the ship offered to the Virginia Company by Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick. Samuel Argall sailed it across the Atlantic at record pace in 1609. It is also the same vessel that Samuel Argall and Thomas Dale used to capture Pocahontas. Further, it was also used to ferry the Rolfe newlyweds to England in 1616. Now captained by Daniel Elfrith, the Treasurer was finally being used for what her investor Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, intended her to be used for: attacking Spanish interests. To that end, Elfrith boarded the San João Bautista and produced letters of marque, which provided his legal right to attack Spanish ships. The technicality here was that Elfrith's documents were in the name of the Duke of Savoy, who was at war with Spain. Had the letters been signed by the English, it would have been an open act of war between 2 nations supposedly at peace with one another in 1619. Or at the very least, it would have exposed Elfrith and his patron Rich as pirates. The White Lion, on the other hand, didn't have the same background as the Treasurer, perhaps, but she's no less well known. Officially, it was a Dutch ship sailing out of Flushing, the Netherlands, as her captain Jan Colin Joop had stated. Acuna was miffed. He believed both ships were in reality English. But what could he do? He was beaten and at Joop and Elfrith's mercy. The victorious captains heard Acuna's protestations, but they paid them no attention. Instead, they marched into the San João Bautista's hold and took 200 of the ablest men and women as their plunder. Acuna was left with 147 of his original 350 Africans, 47 of whom were children, and many of the remaining 100 were close to dying or already dead. Acuna licked his wounds and made it to Veracruz with the remaining 147. He then sailed to Jamaica to sell the remaining captives that he could before sailing back to Africa. Captain Yope sailed the White Lion northward to Virginia, where John Rolfe spotted him at Point Comfort. Rolfe's report states that Yope, quote, brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victual. Thus, Virginia's history added a new people to her pages in 1619 with the potential arrival of Virginia's first permanent black residents. And it was indeed Governor Yardley and Abraham Piercy who had purchased all 20 Africans to work on newly established land grants up the James River. Daniel Elfrith arrived at Point Comfort 4 days after Yope, but Elfrith was an unwelcomed arrival. The first point of contention was Elfrith's letter of marque from the Duke of Savoy. It expired when Savoy and Spain ceased hostilities. Thus, Elfrith's action was indeed a potential act of war, and most certainly piracy. Second, Elfrith's connection to Samuel Argall, the previous Virginia governor, was not a good one due to Argall's deceitful dealings and use of the treasurer to raid Spanish ships in the Caribbean. Simply put, such actions could bring war with Spain, the potential of which could destroy Virginia just as she was starting to mature, something both the company and England did not support. So, when Elfrith and crew pulled into Point Comfort, George Yardley sent John Rolfe to intercept them. The treasurer was a shell of herself, but Elfrith understood that his situation was not a good one, and he decided to beat a hasty retreat after the Kecoughtan settlers refused to trade. By the time Rolfe arrived, Elfrith and his men were already gone. Elfrith took 30 or so Negroes to Bermuda, where a few remained on the island, and others accompanied him back to England for a time before finally landing in Virginia by 1620. Many claim that this is the birth of slavery in America, but that's not the case. Slavery, the type first seen in the 1640s, did not officially exist in English dominions at the time of the Angolan arrivals. The practice was deemed among the vilest actions undertaken by the Spanish, well below the civilized, freedom-loving English standard. In fact, John Smith, once a slave himself, chided Thomas Hunt for capturing and selling natives from Massachusetts to the Spanish. John Porey also voiced his disgust at the situation in that Hunt's action made the natives mortal enemies to the English after Hunt's wicked action. Instead, some of the would-have-been slaves were sold into indentured servanthood, just like the many indentured servants making their way from England to Virginia at the same time. Other Africans, like those that Elfrith took to England before they were brought back to Virginia in 1620, were free. In fact, many of the earliest arriving Africans earned freedom at the end of their indentures. These Angolans, therefore, could serve their time, after which they could own private property, something slaves in later times could not do. Historians such as Tony Williams note that the blacks were seen owning private property and even owned indentured servants for a time. The most notable African to rise above his indentured status, as David Price details, was one Anthony Johnson, who became a farmer, owned 250 acres of land, and by the 1650s had apparently owned slaves himself. Regardless, one can infer how whites might have viewed the 20 and odd Negroes from the 1624 Virginia roster, which did not list any of the 22 Africans' names, though it listed first and last names of all white settlers. Later listings appear to detail Africans in the same way that farm animals were recorded. That being the case, it can potentially be argued that later racial tensions already existed soon after the Angolans' 1619 arrival, even if slavery did not. In reality, the 1619 Angolans were most likely not America's or even Virginia's first Africans, but their arrival in Virginia had a profound, long-lasting effect upon both Virginia and America that can no doubt still be seen throughout all American history. Thus, 1619 is undoubtedly a watershed event not only in Virginia's history, but also black history as well. Assuredly, the 1619 arrival of women and blacks to the colony was momentous, but these events were not the only major firsts to have occurred in this landmark year. We have already seen other important firsts: the first college, the first ironworks, and the first English-speaking Thanksgiving. But the final first is arguably the most important in that it affected every gender and race to live in Virginia, and later the United States. The earliest established form of representative self-government, which we will discuss in our next installment of the Virginia History Podcast.
Seasons come and they go, like the dust on that old dirt road. Try and fight, take it slow. If the ground keeps moving on its own, yeah, the ground keeps moving on its own. Yeah, the ground keeps moving on its own.
Thank you again for supporting the podcast. I greatly appreciate it. Please continue to spread the word and help this colony to continue growing. Start by following us on your favorite podcast provider, like us on Facebook, and visit the website. Sharing episodes and other work is the best way to expand the community. Another way to greatly aid the podcast is by providing feedback on iTunes. If you have yet to do so, please take a few minutes and leave us a comment. Doing so helps bring exposure in the iTunes network. If you would like to do more to help out, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. Links can be found on the website, or one can visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod to see the choices and rewards being offered for your support. I've also added a one-time support button for those who would like to donate to the work being done. It is located on the support page found on the website. Please join me next time as we look at that other major event to take place in 1619, the founding of Virginia's first representative government, the House of Burgesses.
Oh, Baba, do, 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 do. Baba, Baba, ya, Baba, do, do, do. Bado, do, bado, des, bi, di, do, do, ze, ba, ze.